The dress had taken 3 weeks to finish. Mabel knew this because she had counted every night, lying on the narrow cot she shared a room with her friend Petra, listening to the needle scrape against the fabric while the two of them worked by the light of a single candle. It was linen-dyed deep blue, the closest thing to royal blue they could afford after paying the entrance fee to the grand gathering of the Pax. Petra had embroidered small flowers along the hem, flowers that looked like wolves if you stared long enough, and Mabel had repeated that to herself over the past weeks as though it were a good omen. Wolves on the hem. It's a sign. She was 23 years old and had never set foot inside the stone hall of Castle Vorn. Nobody from the southern edge did. The southern edge was where the clanless Omegas lived, the wolves without formal packs, the ones born outside, recognized bloodlines. Mabel was the daughter of a guard who had died in service, and a healer who had passed in the winter before. She had no noble blood, no family name that opened doors, nothing at all except a scent that Petra had always described as absurdly strong for someone so quiet. But she had Dorian's invitation. Dorian Ashvale was the son of Lord Ashvale, a beta of reasonable standing who had promised Mabel, 3 weeks prior, that he would present her before the pack as his chosen one at the recognition ritual. It was an ancient ceremony, simple in form, but powerful in meaning. A wolf would rise before everyone and speak the name of the person he chose as his pack companion. Once spoken in public, the bond carried the weight of law between the clans. Dorian had held her hands at the river's edge, the moon's reflection between them, and said, "I'm going to take you out of here, Mabel, in front of everyone." She had believed him. Petra had helped her pin the braid, had pressed cedarwood oil behind her ears, had adjusted the gray cloak over her shoulders with that older mother way about her that didn't match her 25 years at all. "You look beautiful," Petra had said, and her eyes were wet, which was very rare for someone who claimed not to have cried since she was 16. "Don't exaggerate," Mabel had answered, but she had smiled. Now she stood in the entrance corridor of Castle Vorn, and the smile was gone. The hall was enormous. Stone walls rose to vaulted ceilings blackened by years of torch smoke, and iron chandeliers hung low enough to cast orange light across the faces of hundreds of wolves gathered below. Clan banners dropped from the rafters, each one heavy with dye and embroidery, each one marking territory and bloodline and power. The smell of the place hit her before anything else did. Roasted meat, burning resin, aged oak, leather, and underneath all of that, the deep musk of alphas, thick and layered and pressing against the back of her throat like a hand. Mabel steadied herself against the doorframe. She was not supposed to be overwhelmed. She had told herself that a dozen times on the road up from the southern edge. She was a wolf. She had survived cold winters and a mother's slow death and 3 years of carrying herb bundles to the market alone. She could walk into a stone hall. She walked in. The crowd near the entrance parted slightly, not out of respect, but out of the mild instinctive discomfort that Omegas without pack markings sometimes caused in formal spaces. A few eyes swept over her and moved on. A woman in a burgundy gown whispered something to the man beside her without bothering to lower her voice. Mabel caught the word Southern and kept walking. She found Petra near one of the side columns, holding 2 clay cups of spiced wine and wearing the only good dress she owned, a deep green that made her dark eyes look almost gold. "You made it," Petra said, pressing one of the cups into Mabel's hands immediately. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you might turn around at the gate." Petra scanned the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years reading crowds for danger. "Have you seen him yet?" Mabel had not. She looked. The hall was arranged around a central floor where the recognition ritual would take place, flanked by long banquet tables already heavy with food and candles and the scattered remnants of earlier toasts. Alphas stood in clusters near the head tables, their postures loose but watchful, the kind of stillness that wasn't really stillness at all. She recognized the Ashvale colors on a banner near the east wall, dark green and copper, and followed that direction until she found Dorian. He was standing with his father. And his father was standing with a woman Mabel had never seen before. She was tall, dressed in copper silk that matched the Ashvale banner exactly, her dark hair arranged in elaborate coils at the crown of her head. She was laughing at something Lord Ashvale had said, and the laugh was easy and practiced, and belonged to someone who had never once wondered whether she was allowed to be in a room. Dorian was not looking at Mabel. Dorian was looking at the woman in copper silk. The spiced wine in Mabel's cup suddenly had no taste. "Mabel," Petra said very quietly, "I see it. We don't know what it means yet. I see it, Petra." She kept her voice even. She had learned that young, how to keep her voice even when something inside her chest was pulling in opposite directions. The hall continued around her, loud and warm, and completely indifferent to the small specific collapse happening behind her ribs. The horn sounded. The recognition ritual was beginning. One by one, wolves rose from their places and spoke names into the hall, voices carrying easily in the stone acoustics. Each declaration met with the low collective sound of the assembled packs acknowledging the bond. It was almost beautiful, Mabel thought distantly. Almost. She watched Dorian cross the central floor. He did not look at her. He stopped at the center, where the torchlight was brightest, where every eye in the hall rested, and he spoke clearly and without hesitation into the silence. The name he said was not hers. The woman in copper silk rose from her seat near the Ashvale table and smiled. The hall gave its sound of acknowledgement, deep and resonant, and somewhere in the middle of it Mabel set her clay cup down on the nearest surface and turned toward the door. She did not run. She did not make a sound. She kept her spine straight and her chin level, and she walked, because the only thing left that belonged entirely to her in that moment was the way she chose to leave. She was almost at the corridor when she heard the shift in the room behind her. It was not a sound exactly. It was a change in pressure, the way the air moves differently when something very large and very still decides to stop being still. Several conversations dropped at once. The particular quality of silence that follows the entrance of something that commands silence without asking for it. Mabel did not turn around. She kept walking. And then a voice came from directly behind her, low and unhurried, carrying the kind of quiet authority that didn't need volume to reach every corner of the hall. "Leaving already?" She stopped. Not because she wanted to, because something in that voice landed in her chest like a stone dropped in still water, and her body responded before her mind had any say in the matter. She turned slowly. The man standing 3 feet behind her was the largest person she had ever seen in an enclosed space. He was dressed in black leather and dark fur, with 2 thick braids falling over one shoulder, and the other side of his hair pulled back, revealing a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who took their work seriously. His eyes were pale, almost silver under the torchlight, and they were fixed on her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not pity, not curiosity exactly. Recognition, as though he had been looking for something for a long time, and was mildly surprised to find it near the door. Behind him, at a slight distance, 2 other men had stopped as well. One was broad-shouldered with an easy grin already forming, dark-eyed and amused. The other was leaner, arms crossed, watching the room the way a wolf watches a tree line. The hall had gone noticeably quiet. Mabel looked at the man in front of her and said the only thing her mind produced clearly. "That's not your concern." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "It is now," he said. Mabel held his gaze for exactly as long as it took her to decide that looking away first would cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. Then she looked away. Not down. Sideways, toward the corridor. Toward the clean dark of the exit that was still only a few steps from her. She was aware of the hall watching. She was aware of it the way you are aware of cold water rising around your ankles, slowly, and then all at once. Hundreds of wolves, clan leaders, alphas of bloodlines older than the stones beneath their feet, and every single one of them had stopped their conversation to observe whatever was happening near the eastern door. She did not know who this man was. That was the honest truth, and it was also the only protection she had. If she had known, her legs might have failed her entirely. "I don't know you," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "No," he agreed, as though that were a perfectly reasonable place to begin. "But you will." The broad-shouldered man behind him made a sound that was almost a laugh, quickly converted into a cough when the man in black leather turned his head slightly in that direction. Not a glare. Something quieter than a glare, and somehow more effective. Petra appeared at Mabel's elbow from nowhere, which was one of Petra's particular skills in moments of crisis. "Mabel," she said very carefully, in the tone she normally reserved for situations involving sharp objects or territorial disputes. "Do you know who that is?" "I just said I didn't." "That," Petra said, her voice dropping to something barely above breath, "is Sebastian Vorn." The name moved through Mabel's understanding slowly, and then all at once, the way a candle catches. Vorn. As in Castle Vorn, the hall they were standing in. As in the Vorn bloodline, the oldest alpha line on the continent, unbroken for 11 generations. As in the Alpha King, the wolf who held dominion over every pack, every clan banner hanging in this room, every lord and lady and alpha who had gathered tonight under a roof that bore his family's name. Mabel had just told the Alpha King that he was not her concern. Petra's hand found her arm and held it. Sebastian Vorn had not moved. He stood with the particular stillness of someone who had never once in his life needed to fill silence with noise, watching her process the information with those pale eyes that gave away nothing and somehow communicated everything. There was no amusement in his expression at her obvious shock. There was no condescension either. He simply waited, the way mountains wait, as though time were a resource he had in quantities that made patience effortless. "I apologize," Mabel said, because she was not foolish, and whatever else this night had taken from her, it had not taken her manners. "Don't," he said immediately. She blinked. "Don't apologize for speaking plainly." He took one step closer, not crowding, just closing the particular distance that had made their conversation feel public. His voice dropped just enough that the nearest observers would catch tone, but not words. "Most people in this hall have not said a single honest thing to me tonight." The broad-shouldered man behind him, who Mabel was beginning to understand, was someone who found almost everything entertaining, leaned toward the leaner one, and murmured something. The leaner one, arms still crossed, eyes still on the tree line that only he could see, said nothing in return. Mabel became aware, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable, of her own scent. Omegas without pack bonds carried an unshielded scent. There was no alpha's mark to layer over it, no clan fragrance to blend into it. It was simply hers, open and unguarded, and she had always been quietly embarrassed by how strong it ran. Petra had told her since they were young that it was unusual, that it didn't smell like other omegas from the southern edge, that it had something older in it, something that sat differently in a room. Standing 3 feet from the Alpha King, she understood for the first time why that had always made her uncomfortable in crowds. Every alpha in the vicinity had gone very still. Sebastian's pale eyes moved once, briefly, to the center of the hall, where Dorian Ashvale was still standing with the woman in copper silk, receiving the formal acknowledgement of the gathered packs. Something passed across his expression, quick and unreadable. "You came with the Ashvale invitation," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "And he chose someone else in front of everyone." The words were stated flatly, without cruelty or decoration, and somehow that made them easier to absorb than sympathy would have. Mabel lifted her chin slightly. "Yes." "Then he's a fool," Sebastian said, with the same flat certainty he might use to observe that the sky was dark. "And that is no longer your problem." Behind him, The broad-shouldered man had given up on hiding his grin entirely. He stepped forward half a pace, and up close he was younger than he'd seemed, late 20s perhaps, with the kind of open face that made people trust him before they had any logical reason to. "I'm Callum," he said, as though they were meeting at a market stall. His brother, younger and considerably more charming. "Debatable," the leaner man said, from exactly where he'd been standing, without moving or changing his expression. "That's Reed," Callum said, gesturing. "He's not being rude. That's simply what his face does." Reed looked at Mabel with the kind of steady assessment that felt less like judgment and more like cartography, as though he were memorizing the exact terrain of someone he expected to need to navigate around in the future. "You handled that well," Reed said finally, nodding toward the hall, toward Dorian, toward the whole of what had just happened. "Most people would have made a scene." "Most people weren't wearing their best dress," Mabel said. Callum laughed, genuine and sudden. Even Reed's mouth shifted slightly at one corner. Sebastian's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A small internal movement, like a door opening an inch in a room that had been sealed for a long time. The horn sounded a second time, signaling the end of the recognition portion of the evening and the beginning of the feast. Around them, the hall began to reorganize itself, bodies moving toward tables, the pressure of hundreds of wolves redistributing through the room. In the shift and flow of it, Mabel felt suddenly exposed, a small unmoored thing in a very large current. She looked toward the exit again. "Stay," Sebastian said. Not an order. Or rather, it had the shape of an order and the delivery of a request, and the space between those two things was exactly where his authority lived. "I have no place at these tables," she said honestly. "You have mine." The hall, or the portion of it close enough to hear, went very quiet for the second time that evening. Mabel looked at him directly, searching for the trap, for the performance, for whatever game this was that she didn't understand the rules of yet. She found none of those things. She found only those pale eyes and that unmoving stillness and the simple, undramatic certainty of a man who did not say things he didn't mean. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was not loudly, but she heard every word with absolute clarity. "Because your scent has been the most honest thing in this room since I arrived," he said. "And because the man who let you walk toward that door does not deserve to be the last memory you have of tonight." Mabel stood very still. Somewhere behind her, Dorian Ashvale was laughing at something. The sound carried easily in the stone acoustics, bright and unbothered, the laugh of a man who had no idea what he had discarded. Petra's hand was still on her arm. Mabel felt it loosen slightly, felt her friend's quiet exhale, the small release of tension that meant, "I think this might be all right." Mabel looked at the Alpha King. Then she looked at the empty corridor one last time. Then she turned back. "I'll need a seat for my friend as well," she said. Callum made a sound of pure delight. Reed looked at Sebastian. Sebastian looked at Mabel, and the door behind his eyes opened another inch. "Done," he said. The seat Sebastian gave her was not at the edge of the hall. It was not tucked behind a column, or placed at the far end of a secondary table, where minor guests and uninvited additions were traditionally positioned. It was at the central table, 3 seats from the head, in a chair that had a carved wolf on each armrest, and a view of the entire hall that left nothing hidden. Petra sat beside her, spine perfectly straight, both hands wrapped around her cup, radiating the particular energy of someone who was holding themselves together through sheer determination and would absolutely discuss every detail of this later in exhaustive and breathless terms. Mabel kept her own hands still in her lap and looked at the food she was not eating. The feast had begun in full. Platters of roasted meat moved down the tables, carried by young wolves in pack livery, their steps quick and their eyes carefully forward. The smell of the hall had deepened into something almost solid, fat rendered over fire, dark bread, the sharp bite of wine, candle wax, and underneath everything that dense layered musk of assembled alphas that pressed against the senses like a second heartbeat. Sebastian sat at the head of the table. He did not look at her constantly. That was the first thing she noticed. And it unsettled her more than constant attention would have. He spoke with the wolves to his left, men whose clan markings identified them as leaders of northern packs, and he listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, the table leaned slightly toward him, the way grass leans toward wind. He had a way of making the people near him feel that his attention, when it arrived, was something worth waiting for. Callum sat 2 seats from Mabel on the other side, and had already decided they were friends. "So, the southern edge," he said, tearing a piece of bread with cheerful disregard for ceremony. "You've been there your whole life?" "Most of it." "And nobody from up here ever came down to the market?" "Traders sometimes." She considered. "And a tax collector once, who left quickly." Callum grinned. "That tracks. Reed grew up on the eastern border, which is arguably worse. He once went 4 months without seeing anyone from outside his immediate pack." "I had books," Reed said from across the table, without looking up from his plate. "He had books," Callum confirmed, as though this explained everything and also raised several new questions. Petra had begun to relax by increments. Mabel could feel it in the slight loosening of the air beside her, and had started answering Callum's questions, with the dry precision that Mabel had always found reassuring, the way a person sounds when they're deciding something is survivable. Mabel ate a little, drank less than she wanted to, watched the room. Dorian Ashvale was at a table on the far side of the hall. The woman in copper silk sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and Dorian looked comfortable in the way of someone who had made a decision and stopped thinking about it. He had not looked toward the central table. He did not know, Mabel understood, exactly where she had ended up. If he had, she suspected his expression would have been different. She did not feel the thing she expected to feel, looking at him now. She had expected grief or anger, the hot, specific pain of being discarded by someone who had promised otherwise. She felt instead something quieter and stranger, a kind of distance, as though the version of herself who had stood at the river's edge believing his words was someone she was watching from a great height. Someone young and hopeful in a way that had made complete sense at the time. "He showed you who he was," she told that version of herself. "That's something." "You're quiet," Sebastian said. She turned. He had shifted in his seat toward her at some point without her noticing, which was remarkable for someone his size. Up close, the details of him were more specific. A thin scar along his jaw, barely visible in the torchlight, the braids held by small rings of dark metal, the pale eyes that caught the candle flame and held it in a way that made her think of ice over deep water. "I'm thinking," she said. "About him?" She considered lying, decided against it. "About the version of me that believed him," she said. She wasn't wrong to hope. She just gave it to the wrong person. Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Around them the feast continued, loud and warm and entirely occupied with itself. "That's a generous way to look at it," he said. "It's the only way that doesn't make me feel like a fool for the rest of my life." Something moved in his expression, slow and deliberate. "You are not a fool," he said. "You are an Omega from the southern edge who walked into this hall without a pack name, without a clan banner, and without anyone standing beside you. And when the man who invited you chose someone else in front of every alpha on this continent, you left with your head up." He paused. "I've watched lords crumble under less." Mabel looked at him carefully. "You were watching me before," she said. It was not quite an accusation. "Yes." "For how long?" "Since you came through the eastern door," he said. "Your scent reached the hall before you did. I noticed it before I saw you." She felt the heat rise in her face and was grateful for the dim warmth of the torchlight. "Everyone always notices the scent," she said, the old discomfort surfacing briefly. "It's been that way since I was young. I never understood why." Sebastian looked at her with an expression she was beginning to learn, the one where he knew something and was deciding how much of it to say. "How much do you know about your mother's bloodline?" he asked. The question landed differently than she expected. "Very little," she said slowly. "She didn't speak about her family. She came to the southern edge before I was born, and she stayed. When I asked why she left wherever she was from, she said some doors close from both sides." Sebastian absorbed this without visible reaction. "Your mother's name," he said carefully. "Senna. Senna of no house," she always said. She thought it was funny. It was not funny to Sebastian. Something in his face shifted, very slightly, the way stone shifts before a crack shows. "I knew that name," he said quietly. "I didn't know she had a daughter." The feast roared on around them. Callum was making Petra laugh at something, which was itself a small miracle. Reed was watching the hall with his habitual vigilance, though his eyes moved to Sebastian briefly, and then to Mabel and back, and something in his expression changed in a way she couldn't interpret. "What does that mean?" Mabel asked. "That you knew her name." "It means," Sebastian said, choosing each word with visible precision, "that you are not from the southern edge. Not originally. It means your bloodline has a name, and that name is one the older packs would recognize immediately." Mabel stared at him. Across the hall, Dorian Ashvale laughed at something, bright and easy and absent. "That's why," she said, understanding arriving in pieces. "The scent. That's why it's always been too strong. Too old," Sebastian said. "It's an old blood scent. Unmistakable once you know what you're smelling." He looked at her steadily. "The alphas in this hall who went quiet when you walked in weren't imagining things." Mabel felt the ground beneath the evening rearrange itself completely. She had come here tonight as nobody, as a clanless Omega in a borrowed dress with wolves on the hem, hoping a Beta's son would say her name in front of a crowd and give her the smallest foothold in a world that had never made room for her. Now the Alpha King was looking at her as though she had always been something, and the world simply hadn't told her yet. "What name?" she asked finally. "What is the name?" Sebastian opened his mouth, and the doors of the hall slammed open. The doors hit the stone walls with a sound like thunder caught indoors. Every head in the hall turned. The feast noise collapsed in an instant. Cups lowered. Conversations severed mid-sentence. And the particular silence that followed was the kind that carries weight, the kind that means something has entered the room that changes the shape of everything already inside it. 3 wolves stood in the doorway. They were large, all of them, dressed in traveling leathers still damp from rain, carrying the road smell of wet earth and pine resin, and something sharper underneath, an aggression that hadn't been put away yet. The one at the center was the oldest, silver threading through dark hair at his temples, a clan marking burned into the leather at his shoulder that Mabel didn't recognize, but that made Reed straighten in his chair across the table in a way that was very quiet and very deliberate. Callum had stopped laughing. The wolf at the center of the doorway let his gaze move across the hall with the unhurried confidence of someone who expected rooms to wait for him. It crossed the minor tables, the clan leaders, the banners, and then it found the central table and stopped. It stopped on Mabel. She felt it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. The wolf's nostrils moved, just slightly, just enough. And then his expression changed into something she had no name for, something between recognition and hunger, an old anger that had been sitting in a cold place for a very long time. Sebastian had not moved. He sat exactly as he had been sitting, one hand resting on the table, utterly still, but the quality of his stillness had changed completely. It was no longer the stillness of a man at rest. It was the stillness of something that has decided what it is about to do and is simply waiting for the correct moment. "Caspian Drell," Reed said very quietly, to no one in particular. It was the tone of someone identifying a species of weather. The name meant nothing to Mabel. It clearly meant a great deal to everyone else. She watched it move through the hall like a current, the subtle repositioning of bodies, the way certain alphas near the head tables shifted their weight forward almost imperceptibly, while others drew back. Drell walked into the hall without being invited to do so. His two companions stayed at the door. He was looking at Mabel with an intensity that made the air between them feel occupied by something she could not see, but could absolutely feel, pressing against her skin. "So it's true," he said. His voice carried easily in the stone acoustics without him raising it. "Senna's girl, in Vorn's hall." Mabel did not flinch. She was proud of that later. "You knew my mother," she said. "I knew your mother," Drell confirmed, stopping at the edge of the central table, close enough now that she could see the clan mark clearly, a wolf mid-leap inside a circle of old script. "I knew her very well. Before she ran." "She didn't run," Mabel said, and was surprised by the certainty in her own voice, a certainty that arrived from somewhere older than memory. "She left." Drell's eyes moved from her to Sebastian, and the shift in them was immediate and cold. "You have something that belongs to my bloodline, Vorn," he said. The hall was absolutely silent now. Sebastian stood up. It was not a dramatic motion. He did not push back his chair, or raise his voice, or reach for the short blade at his hip. He simply rose, which was in itself a statement, because standing Sebastian Vorn occupied space in a way that made the ceiling feel lower and the room feel smaller, not through threat alone, but through the sheer fact of his presence. The way a mountain occupies a landscape not by aggression, but by simply being exactly what it is. "She belongs to no bloodline but her own," Sebastian said. The words were even and final, the tone of a man closing a door. "Her mother was claimed by my father before she fled," Drell said, his voice hardening. "That claim passes." "That claim," Sebastian said, "died with your father. Old law. You know this." "Old law also says an unclaimed omega of Drell blood reverts to the house on discovery." Drell's eyes went back to Mabel, and the hunger in them had not diminished at all. "She's been undiscovered for 23 years. That ends tonight." Mabel felt Petra's hand find her wrist under the table and grip it hard. She understood, with a cold and clarifying precision, that she was being discussed as though she were an object left in a room that two people were arguing over the ownership of. She had spent her entire life being invisible to rooms like this one. She found, sitting in the carved chair at the Alpha King's table with a wolf she had never met declaring her his property, that she had a very clear and very steady feeling about that. She stood up. Both men looked at her. "I am not a claim," she said. Her voice did not shake. "I am not a reversion. I am not something that passes or transfers or belongs to a house I have never heard of because of a debt my mother didn't agree to." She looked at Drell directly. "Whatever your father believed he was owed, he is dead. And I am standing here." The hall made a sound, low and collective, not quite a murmur, something more fundamental than that, the sound of a large group of people recalibrating their understanding of what they were watching. Drell stared at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, and the smile was worse than the hunger had been. "She has her mother's mouth," he said, almost to himself. "That will change." Sebastian moved, not toward Drell, not yet. He stepped to Mabel's side, one pace, placing himself not in front of her but beside her, shoulder aligned with hers. And the message in that positioning was so precise and so clear that even Mabel felt it in her bones. Not in front of, beside. She stands. I stand with her. You will not speak to her that way in my hall, Sebastian said. And now the evenness was gone, replaced by something lower and more dangerous. Something that had been sitting under the calm the way fire sits under the surface of a coal. You will not speak to her that way anywhere. If you have a legal claim to present, you will present it in the morning before the full council, in writing, with witnesses. Tonight you are a guest in my hall who has not been invited to this table, and you will conduct yourself accordingly. Drell held Sebastian's gaze for 3 full seconds. In the hall, no one breathed. Then Drell stepped back, a single pace, just enough to acknowledge the boundary without conceding the argument. His eyes moved to Mabel one last time, and in them was a promise she didn't want. A promise that said this isn't finished. A promise that said I know what you are, and I will not forget. Morning then, he said, and turned, and walked back toward the door. His companions fell in beside him. The doors did not slam this time. They closed with a soft, deliberate sound that was somehow louder than the opening had been. For a moment, the hall held its silence. Then Sebastian sat down, and the room exhaled, and noise returned in a wave, conversation crashing back in like water filling a space that had been briefly emptied. Mabel sat down. Her legs were steadier than she expected. Petra released her wrist and said nothing, which was how Mabel knew her friend was frightened. Who was he? Mabel said. The real answer, not the legal one. Sebastian turned to her. The dangerous thing under the calm had receded, but not entirely, and she could still feel it in the particular set of his jaw. Caspian Drell is the alpha of the Drell Pack, Eastern Mountains, he said. Old blood. Older than Vorn by some accounts. His father was one of the last wolves to practice the old claiming laws before the council outlawed them. He paused. Your mother was 17 when she came to his father's hall as a servant. She was there for 2 seasons before she disappeared. Mabel looked at the table. She thought about her mother, about the way Senna had always angled her back toward walls in crowded rooms, about the way she had never once spoken of where she came from, about some doors closed from both sides, said with a lightness that Mabel now understood had been constructed very carefully over a very long time. She ran, Mabel said quietly. She ran, Sebastian confirmed. And she was smart too. And she built a life on the southern edge, and she kept you safe, and she kept you hidden. His voice had changed slightly. Something in it softer now, careful. She did everything right. Except she didn't tell me. She may have been protecting you from exactly this. Mabel considered that for a long moment. The candles on the table had burned lower while she wasn't paying attention, the light warmer and closer now. And in it, Sebastian's face was less severe than it had seemed at first. Or perhaps she was simply learning to read it differently. You said you knew her name, Mabel said. Before, you recognized it. Yes. How? He was quiet for a moment. Because my father spent 2 years trying to find her, he said. Not for Drell, for her own protection. He knew what she'd escaped, and he wanted to offer her sanctuary. He never found her. Sebastian looked at Mabel steadily. I think now that she didn't want to be found. By anyone. Mabel closed her eyes briefly. Her mother had been 20 years running from a name Mabel had never known. Had built a quiet life in a place no one looked twice at. Had raised a daughter alone. Had kept the fire going through cold winters and said nothing. Nothing about any of it. Because knowing would have meant danger, and she had chosen safety over history every single time. Some doors close from both sides. She understood now. The door her mother had closed had been closed to protect her. And it had worked, for 23 years, until Mabel had walked into a stone hall in a blue dress with wolves on the hem, chasing a promise made by a man who couldn't keep it, and her scent had reached the room before she did. She opened her eyes. Callum was watching her with an expression stripped of its usual lightness, something genuine and quiet underneath. Reed had not looked away from the eastern doors since Drell had left through them, and she understood that Reed would not stop watching those doors for the rest of the evening. "What happens in the morning?" she asked Sebastian. "The council. What does he actually have?" "Very little legally," Sebastian said. "The old claiming laws were dissolved. A servant's implied bond carries no weight under current pack law." He met her eyes. "But Drell is not a man who operates only within legal boundaries. He will argue what he cannot prove and apply pressure where he cannot argue." "And the council?" "The council will not move against me on his behalf," Sebastian said, with simple certainty. "But you should not be without pack protection before that meeting. A clanless Omega, even one with old blood, has limited standing to speak on her own behalf under formal proceedings." Mabel looked at him. The thing he was not quite saying sat in the air between them, patient and still, like him. "You're saying I need a pack," she said. "I'm saying," he replied carefully, "that I have one, and that the offer I made when I asked you to stay at this table was not only about a seat at a feast." Petra made a very small sound beside her that she would later describe as involuntary. Mabel held Sebastian's gaze and felt the full weight of the evening settle around her, not crushing, not collapsing, but present. Real, the blue dress, the wolves on the hem. Dorian saying a different name into a torchlit hall, the doors slamming open, her mother's silence stretching back 20 years like a long shadow she had never known to look for. And this man, still and certain beside her, offering something she hadn't come here to find. "I need to think," she said. "You have until morning," he said. "That is not a pressure. It is simply the truth." She nodded. Across the hall, she noticed for the first time that Dorian Ashvale had finally looked toward the central table. He was staring at her with an expression she recognized, because she had worn something like it herself earlier that evening. The particular look of someone understanding, too late, the exact size of what they have let go. She did not feel satisfaction at the sight of it. She felt instead something much quieter. She felt free. She did not sleep. Petra had been given a small room off the eastern corridor, one of the guest quarters that Sebastian's staff had prepared without fuss or explanation, as though housing unexpected women from the southern edge were a perfectly ordinary occurrence in Castle Vorn. The room had a real bed, a wool blanket thick enough to press down on the chest, and a window that looked out over the forest surrounding the castle walls. Mabel had sat on the edge of that bed for an hour, listening to Petra breathe slowly into sleep, and watching the tree line in the dark. The forest moved the way forests do at night, which is to say it moved in ways that were probably wind, and felt like something else. She thought about her mother. She thought about Senna carrying a secret for 20 years like a stone sewn into the lining of a coat, something you stop noticing until someone asks you why you always lean slightly to one side. She thought about the southern edge in winter, the two of them in a small house with a fire that needed constant feeding, her mother's hands moving over dried herbs with practiced efficiency, the quiet between them that had always felt like peace, and now felt like it had contained something else as well. Something kept. Something protected. She thought about a 17-year-old girl in a strange hall who had understood that running was the only door available to her and had taken it without looking back. "I understand you," Mabel thought, in the direction of a woman who was no longer there to hear it. "I understand all of it now." She was still sitting at the window when the sky behind the forest began to separate from black into the deep blue that comes before dawn, and she made her decision not as a sudden thing, but as a recognition, the way you recognize a path you have been walking without knowing it. She had not come to Castle Vorn to find a pack, but she had not come to Castle Vorn to find Dorian either. Not really. She had come because something in her had known, in the wordless way the body knows things before the mind catches up, that the southern edge was not the whole of her life, that the smallness she had been assigned was not the smallness she was made of. She had simply been waiting for the right door. The council met at mid-morning in the Hall of Records. a long room lined floor to ceiling with bound volumes and stone tablets, smelling of ink and old leather and the particular mustiness of accumulated law. It was smaller than the feast hall and colder, and the light came through narrow windows and pale winter bars that fell across the floor like lines on a page. 7 council wolves sat at the long table. Sebastian sat at its head. Reed stood at the wall to the right, arms crossed, watching the door with the focused patience of a man who had anticipated exactly who would come through it. Caspian Drell arrived with a written document and 2 witnesses. Mabel arrived with Petra beside her, her gray cloak straight on her shoulders, and her braid pinned up in the way Petra had insisted upon at dawn, because you were not walking in there looking like you slept poorly even if you did, and with Sebastian Vorn's packmark freshly spoken over her in the old form before the meeting began. She had gone to him at first light. He had been awake, standing at the map table in his study with Reed, and when she appeared in the doorway, he had looked at her for one moment, with an expression that was not surprise, but something adjacent to relief. Something he allowed to show for exactly as long as it took him to understand that she had made her choice. And then it settled back into the stillness she was learning to read as his version of warmth. "I've thought about it," she had said. "I know," he had said. "I heard you in the corridor." "You heard me thinking?" "I heard you stop pacing." She had almost smiled. "I want the packmark, and I want it understood that it is a choice, not a rescue." "It was always a choice," he said. "That was never in question." The old form was short. 3 sentences, spoken and answered, witnessed by Reed, who performed the function with the gravity of someone who understood that certain moments deserved to be held carefully. When it was done, something in the air around Mabel shifted slightly, a settling, like a key finding its lock. She felt it in her chest, not as a loss of something but as an addition, a weight that was not heavy but present, like a hand placed steadily at her back. In the Hall of Records, Drell presented his document with the confidence of a man who had spent the night sharpening his argument to a fine edge. The council read it in silence. Sebastian waited. Mabel sat straight in her chair and did not look at Drell, because she had decided the previous night that Caspian Drell did not deserve the specific attention of her eyes. The head of the council, an old female wolf named Rowena with silver hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had outlasted 7 alpha kings and expected to outlast several more, set down the document and looked over it at the room. "The claim references servant bond law under the 3rd Charter," Rowena said, in the tone of someone identifying an extinct species. "The 3rd Charter was dissolved 41 years ago." She looked at Drell. "This document would have had legal standing before most of the people in this room were born." "The dissolution was contested," Drell said. "The dissolution was contested," Rowena agreed pleasantly. "And the contest was resolved in the 22nd year of the current charter in favor of dissolution. I wrote that ruling myself." She folded her hands on the table. "I remember it clearly." One of Drell's witnesses shifted his weight. "Furthermore," Rowena continued, picking up a second document that had been placed before her, "the one bearing Sebastian's seal, the Omega in question has accepted pack protection under Vorn, spoken in the old form before 2 witnesses at dawn this morning. Under current law, that supersedes any residual claim of the type you are presenting, dissolved or otherwise." Drell looked at Mabel for the first time since entering the room. She met his gaze steadily and said nothing. "This isn't finished," he said, and the words were directed at her, not at the council, not at Sebastian. Sebastian spoke from the head of the table, quietly, without heat. "Yes," he said. "It is." He let that sit for one moment. "You are free to leave Castle Vorn before the midday bell. If you are still within my borders after that, I will consider your presence a challenge under pack law and I will respond accordingly." He paused. "I would encourage you to leave before the midday bell." Drell stood at the table for 3 seconds that felt much longer. Then he took his document, turned, and walked out of the Hall of Records without his witnesses, who exchanged a brief glance and followed. The door closed. Rowena looked at Sebastian with the expression of someone who had seen this kind of thing before and found it moderately satisfying. "Well handled," she said simply, and began organizing her papers. The grand gathering formally closed that afternoon. Clan banners came down from the rafters of the feast hall, packed into cases and loaded onto wagons. Wolves who had come from great distances began the long journeys back to their territories, moving out through the castle gates in groups, the sounds of the road collecting around the stone walls, and then fading as distance swallowed them. Dorian Ashvale left with his pack in the early afternoon. He passed through the main courtyard, while Mabel was standing near the eastern wall with Petra, watching the departures. He saw her. She knew he saw her because he stopped walking for a full beat, and the woman in copper silk, who was now formally his chosen, walked 2 steps ahead before realizing he had stopped and turned back with a question on her face. Mabel watched him take in the details. The straightness of her posture, the Vorn mark, small but visible at her collarbone where the cloak had shifted. The fact that she was standing in the main courtyard of the Alpha King's castle, as though she had every right to be there, because she did. Dorian opened his mouth. He closed it again. He turned and walked through the gate, and the woman in copper silk fell into step beside him, and the crowd closed behind them, and Mabel watched them go with the same feeling she had experienced the previous night, that clean and quiet freedom, the particular lightness of a thing fully released. "Are you all right?" Petra asked. "Yes," Mabel said. And she meant it completely. 3 weeks later, Petra returned to the southern edge, not to stay, but to gather what mattered and close what needed closing. She came back to Castle Vorn with 2 bags and a herb bundle that smelled like the old house, and she was given a room in the eastern wing and a position in the castle's records hall that suited her precise and methodical mind, so exactly that Rowena herself commented it seemed overdue. The southern edge did not disappear. It was still there, as it had always been, but it was no longer the boundary of Mabel's world. It was simply a place she had come from, one part of a larger map. Sebastian did not rush anything. That was perhaps the thing she had needed most without knowing it. Not speed, not grand declarations, but the patience of someone who understood that a woman who had spent her life being overlooked did not need to be swept into anything. She needed to be still long enough to understand that she was allowed to take up space. He gave her the run of the library, which was enormous and disorganized in the way of collections assembled by people who loved books more than systems. He ate breakfast with her most mornings, the 2 of them at the small table in the study with maps spread between the cups, talking about pack histories and border decisions and the slow work of maintaining peace between bloodlines that had centuries of grievance between them. He asked her opinion and listened to the answers, which was something she had not expected, and which she found, gradually, to be the thing that undid her more than anything else. He saw her, clearly and specifically, and without any apparent desire for her to be different than she was. One evening, 6 weeks after the night she had almost walked out of the feast hall and kept walking, they were in the library when he looked up from the document he was reading and said, without preamble, "Rowena asked me this morning if I intended to formalize the bond." Mabel set down the book she was holding. "What did you tell her?" she asked. "I told her I intended to ask," he said, "and that the answer was entirely yours to give." She looked at him across the table. This man who had found her at a door she was walking out of and had never once made her feel that staying was anything less than her own choice. She thought about her mother, who had closed doors to stay safe and had never stopped running. She thought about herself at 23 in a blue dress with wolves on the hem, walking into a room that had not been built for her, and finding, unexpectedly, that it was. She thought about what it meant to choose with full knowledge and open eyes, and no promise extracted under pressure. "Yes," she said. Sebastian was quiet for a moment. The candle between them burned steadily. "Yes to my asking," he said carefully, "or yes to the question itself?" "Both," she said. "Yes to both." The corner of his mouth moved, and then, for the first time since she had known him, it became something more than that. Something full and real and unhurried, a smile that reached the pale eyes and changed them completely. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Outside the library windows, the forest surrounding Castle Vorn stood dark and quiet and full of the sounds of the night. Wind in the branches, an owl somewhere distant, the low call of wolves moving through the tree line in the easy way of a pack that knows its territory completely. Inside, the candle burned. And Mabel, daughter of Senna of No House, Omega of the Southern Edge, sat at the Alpha King's table in the Alpha King's library, with the Alpha King's hand warm over hers, and felt, for the first time in her life, the deep and total certainty of someone who has arrived exactly where they are supposed to be. She was not rescued. She was not claimed. She had simply finally come home.